Well, it has been a little while since I have taught the Sunday auditorium class. We have I forgot to tell you earlier, Misty, we got a PowerPoint for this one. It's the rebuilders up on the OneDrive. If I could get a couple people to pass out some books, unless everybody's already gotten theirs. People have? Okay, well, that works. So we are going to be covering Ezra and Nehemiah throughout this quarter. We're beginning a new quarter. We'll be swapping over from me to whoever else at the end of August, beginning of September. Ezra and Nehemiah are really interesting books. Have you spent much time in Ezra and Nehemiah? Where would you say that these books fall on your familiarity? One being totally unfamiliar, 10 being extremely familiar. Where might you fall? Where might you rate yourself on that scale?
Yeah, pretty familiar to me.
Yeah.
We've had the story here before about the rebuilding of the, mainly about the wall first.
Yeah.
And then that king, the Lord touched that king and sent it to Israel, and he went back to rebuild the city.
Yeah.
And there's a great story that goes on with it.
Yeah. So I think that's probably where most of us would fall somewhere. There's several stories in these books that we're very familiar with, right? We kind of know the gist of, Nehemiah builds the wall. And for some reason, I think we're a lot more familiar with Nehemiah than we are Ezra. But if we know anything about the book, we know Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem, he rebuilds the wall around Jerusalem, and they may face some adversity, but they get the wall built, and everybody celebrates. And that's a good lesson, and that's one of the main themes of the book, one of the main central events of these book. But there's a lot more to it, and I know personally, I've never really done a deep dive really into Ezra and Nehemiah. I would give myself maybe a 4 on the 1 to 10 scale, but that's good because we're going over it. So hopefully by the end you'll have a good, at least higher than a 7. So that's our goal, to be higher than a 7 by the end of the series. These books are really books that are all about restoring and rebuilding. They're books that are about revival. If that sounds familiar, that was our theme for last year. And last year we pulled from the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah a lot in our Sunday sermons. Because that's what these books are about. They're about a people that are needing restoration. They're about a city, the city of God, the city of Jerusalem, that has been destroyed and needs to be rebuilt. It's about a spiritual revival that Ezra brings about, and the returning back not just to the land, not just to the rebuilding the city physically, but a return spiritually to the way things should have been. Because for a long time, things have not been what they should be. And so these are books that are very good when we talk about leadership, especially church leadership, and some principles to evaluate. And there are lots and lots of great examples of leadership, especially from Nehemiah, about what are the things leaders should do, what are some of the things leaders shouldn't do. And so when you read through it, for those who are in positions of church leadership, which quite a few are in class today, this is a good book to kind of read and evaluate, well, what am I doing? How am I leading? For those of you who might not be, this is a really good book to kind of do some self-evaluation and think, am I a follower like the followers of Nehemiah? Every leader needs to be a follower. Being a follower is not a derogatory thing by any means, but as a church, we follow the leadership of the elders. We follow the leadership of Christ. And so, as a follower, are we fulfilling our obligations as a follower? Are we being good followers? And I think it challenges everybody, just in general, to be very diligent about your service to God. Things that are accomplished in these books could not just happen if it was just Ezra. It could not just happen if it was just Nehemiah. It could not just happen if it was just Jerusalem. They needed lots of help. They needed people to stand beside them and pick up the plow and work alongside them. And I think it's kind of interesting when you go through these books. There's quite a few chapters that we're going to or sections of chapters at least, that we're just going to kind of skim over because it's a lot of names that aren't super significant to what we're studying, but it's not insignificant that the names are listed. They're the list of the people that are there helping Nehemiah. They're listed for a reason. They're listed because these are the workers. They're the people who contributed to the rebuilding of Jerusalem and to the restoration of Judaism and to the rebuilding of the temple. And so the names are important, and I think that's significant. Any thoughts about any of that so far? When you think about leadership, church leadership, is Ezra and Nehemiah kind of the place to go to think about that? Has it been? Well, maybe it will be by the end. So, I know last week David Smith had a good Nehemiah lesson, and he pulled some of my points. So, fight him on that. So let's go through and talk about. Today we're just going to do kind of a basic introduction. I think it's really helpful whenever you start to look at a book or a book series or something like that. Not just to dive straight in, but to get some of the information about the book before you actually get into the book. Just so you can understand the context of everything that's going on, where it falls on the timeline and that sort of thing, just so you can have a better picture. So let's kind of get a summary. If you were to summarize the books, what are the books all about? What is the main thrust of the books?
Restoration.
Yeah, restoration. The books are about the return of some Israelites, not all the Israelites, from Babylonian captivity. And it's about their work to rebuild, restore home and religion. And so there's the physical rebuilding and the physical restoration, but there's also a spiritual side to all of this, and especially championed by Ezra, a spiritual rebuilding and a spiritual restoration. So when you kind of look at how the books have been, I think it's really interesting that the books were originally one book. There's a couple examples of this you see, especially in the Old Testament, much more than perhaps the New Testament. But when these books were written, there were not Ezra and Nehemiah, two separate books. It was one book. It was Ezra and Nehemiah. And the distinction between the two comes a little bit later in history, probably about 500-600 years later in history. It's probably not really seen as distinct books until maybe the first, probably the 2nd century really of Christianity, that these books are seen as distinct from one another. But in Hebrew, they're one book. Ezra ends and Nehemiah picks up right after. And so I think that's significant, kind of interesting. You have a couple examples of that kind of thing throughout the Old Testament. What are some other examples of that? I think a good one is 1st or 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel. Those 1st and 2nd books are generally books that were just one book. And they've been subdivided for various reasons. Sometimes because they're just too long for one single scroll. If you think back when people are writing this down by hand copies, they're doing it on scrolls. That takes up a lot of space. And so you have one scroll and you can't quite fit a whole 2nd book. So what you do, you just grab a 2nd scroll. And so they become kind of distinct that way. but they're really just one continuous story. If you read 1 Kings, 2 Kings flows right into it. If you read 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel flows right into it. And so Ezra and Nehemiah is kind of the same way. It's just one story. It's the continuous story. Is that something you had known before? Does that make sense? Have you ever thought about that? It's a rainy day. I'm tired. I think you are too. Yeah. So,
There's a lot of stories within this story.
yeah.
You know, when you went out, there's a story there, when he went out by himself there at night,
Mm-hmm.
to check out, just to get the lay of the land. I've imagined how that would feel to walk out at night and everything was calm and you're trying to make plans. He had a wonderful job to do there, and the Lord blessed him with those abilities to get it done.
Yeah.
And what really stands out and sticks in my mind is about, I was always a hands-on cabinet maker or stuff like that. Those guys those craftsmen that did this work, like when they built up the gates, you know,
Yeah.
and cut those cedars, timbers to fit, that had to be, if you think about it, how did they saw? Did they have saws? Did they have chisels that were, how would you sharpen it? It had to be against a rock. I just think about the tools and of course, God gave them the wisdom and the talent.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an enormous amount of labor that's going to go into books, and I think that is really interesting. When you look at the structure of this book, these books, however you want to talk about it, there's kind of a threefold structure. It follows after three characters. The first being Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel is kind of the main highlight feature character in the first 6 chapters of Ezra. What is Zerubbabel's main mission? What is he going to be doing? He's going to be tasked with rebuilding the temple. And so his main focus is to rebuild the temple that was destroyed. Then you have Ezra. And Ezra is kind of the focus through the rest of the book of Ezra, chapters 7 through 10. And what's Ezra's main focus? Yeah, bring back the religion, have a revival. And so Ezra is the main focus of that. Then you have Nehemiah, and through chapters 1 through 7 of Nehemiah, Nehemiah has work in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem is the main focus. And then the rest of the book of Nehemiah is just kind of a conclusion to all of these other the events of these three things. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But each had a mission and each had opposition that they faced. So every one of these guys, they had a clear-cut mission in mind for what they went to go achieve. Each of these guys returns from Babylon, right? Babylon's really far away from Jerusalem. And they each come from Babylon all the way back to Jerusalem for a single purpose, to do something. And they face a lot of challenges in that doing. And so Zerubbabel, he comes to rebuild the temple, but he's going to have some opposition in the form of people that are tempting him to spiritually compromise. In Ezra chapter, I think it's 4, it's Ezra 4, you have some locals that come to Zerubbabel, and they offer to help rebuild the temple alongside him. And, well, that seems all great, except there's a problem. They're not what they should be spiritually. Look at 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 33. You want to flip over there? It's kind of an interesting passage in Ezra 4, because you would think that Ezra would want all the help he can get, all the hands he can get. And these people come and they say, well, let's go turn there first, I guess, just real quickly. In Ezra 4, pick up verse 1. Now the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel. They approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building the house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." And so why would Zerubbabel and all these other guys, why would they turn down this help? These people say, "We worship God just like you." Why would they turn this down? Well, their claim to worship God just like them is just that. It's a claim. It's not necessarily true. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 33, you have a description of the people that have settled in Samaria when the Assyrian conquest happens before the Babylonian conquest. The Assyrian king takes people and he relocates them all throughout the world, all throughout their empire. And Samaria was a major center of that. And so there's a lot of mixing and mingling between the Samaritans and various Gentile peoples. And so part of what they do is there's a multi-religiousness that goes on, multi-faithness that's happening in Samaria. And so it causes some problems. So the king commands that a priest go up to Samaria and instruct all the people about the ways of the God of the land, as they kind of saw it. And so in verse 32 through 33, they also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests and of the high places, to sacrifice for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. And so there's this multi-religiousness that's going on. These people say, "Listen, let's help you out. We believe in God just like you do, and we sacrifice to God just like you do." But the problem is they don't worship God just like Zerubbabel does. They also worship the gods of their other lands, and they worship all these other false gods. And so, as Zerubbabel has a conflict, do I take the help of these guys, or do I stay spiritually pure and spiritually uncompromised? And they're going to choose not to compromise. Ezra, his mission is spiritual revival, but he has a problem too. And the problem is that all these people who come back from Babylon, they're not married to people they ought to be married to. There's been a lot of intermarrying when that's been prohibited, right? And so Ezra is going to point to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Turn over there. Deuteronomy 23 and verses 1 through 4. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose male organs cut off shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord. No one born of a forbidden union may enter into the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. And goes on. Ezra is going to take this as a rationale that he's going to say, "Listen, you guys you're in wrong marriages. You've married and intermingled with the people of the land. You've married and intermingled with Babylonians, and you're coming back with wives that you ought not be married to." And so there's a spiritual risk of compromise there. Do we let this slide or do we not? How do we address this issue? Because this is a major issue, right? And so that's going to be a major thing that Ezra is going to have to encounter as he begins to get the people back on track with the religion that they should have been practicing all along. But as they've been carried away to exile and gone through all the years, they've departed from those things. And so that's going to be a big issue for Ezra. Nehemiah, with the one we're probably most familiar with, Nehemiah goes to rebuild the walls, and that's all good until he gets some threats and discouragement by Sanballat and Tobiah. They make fun of him, and they mock him, and they threaten them. And so Nehemiah says, listen, you're going to carry a hammer with one hand, and you're going to carry a sword with the other, right? And so they eventually overcome those challenges that they have there. And so this is going to be kind of a reoccurring theme. You're going to have somebody who's sent on a mission. He's going to go and start fulfilling that mission. He's going to have some opposition, and there's going to be some resolution. And then you're going to have that again, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And then the end of Nehemiah is going to be an interesting conclusion to all the things that have happened so far. So, everybody's favorite thing, trying to figure out where does this fit in the Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah are just about smack dab in the middle of your Old Testament, right? Is that where they fall in regards to chronology of history? No. Where do they fall? Yeah, they're some of the last books of the entire Old Testament. In fact, they're contemporaries with Malachi, who is the last writer of the New Testament, of the Old Testament. And so, just to kind of get some time frame, this is all after David. This is after the divided kingdoms. This is after all of those things. In 606 to 605 BC, Babylon comes in and they conquer Israel. And it is a result of Israel and Judah's wickedness. They've sinned, and they've allowed sin to go unchecked. And so Babylon comes in, just as was prophesied by God, and they destroy everything. And it's during this time period that you have a lot of different Bible books that come into effect or talk about this time period. What are some of those that talk about the exile? Daniel. Daniel's one of those first few that are carted off into exile. What are some others that talk about this time period? Ezra and Nehemiah, obviously. Ezekiel, yeah. Ezekiel is a prophet who should have been a priest, but he's not where the priest should be. He's off in Babylon, so he can't be a priest like he ought to have been. Think of Jeremiah. Jeremiah may be a little bit before those other guys, but Jeremiah prophesies about the destruction of Babylon. He's called the weeping prophet because of it. He has a horrible message that he has to tell the people that, listen, judgment is coming on you, and it's going to be bad. And of course, that's what the book of Jeremiah is about. And then Lamentations is his lamenting over the fact that these things have actually come to pass. And so Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezra, Nehemiah, obviously, Esther. Esther is in Babylon. She's going to be a major character in kind of this time frame. You got some minor prophets like Malachi there towards the end. So this is a very significant period where a large chunk of the Old Testament is going to happen or refer to Babylonian exile. And so it begins in 606, 605 BC. Then, in 585, you're going to have the actual destruction of the temple. And so the conquest, the siege begins, but it takes a little bit of time to actually come to fruition. And the destruction of the temple is really the seal of the deal. Flip over to 2 Kings chapter 25, if you would. 2 Kings 25, verses 8 through 12, we have a description of destruction. In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, that was the 9th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. And he burned the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. And all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls of Jerusalem. And the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the multitude, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried into exile. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. And so you have, this is kind of the final event in the Babylonian conquest. They lay siege to Jerusalem, and it is a horrible, horrible time. It's a time where you have people that are starving to death. The Bible talks about a couple instances where people are eating their children. It is a truly horrific siege. And finally, it comes to an end. You can imagine there's many that just leave the walls and desert because they're starving to death. And eventually, the captain of the guard, the high-ranking military official, comes in, just destroys everything. He burns down the temple of God. He burns down the king's house, the house that David had built. He burns down all the other houses that are of important people. And the city just is totally ruined. Breaks down the walls. Now anybody can just come in and ransack the place. There's no defenses left. Yeah, it is hard, I think, to even begin to comprehend how damaging and demoralizing that this kind of thing would be. The temple is the absolute center of Judaism. The temple is the place where the Ark of the Covenant lies. It's the place where the presence of God dwells. It's the place where the priests perform all their important priestly duties and sacrifice and all that sort of thing. And it's gone. It's totally destroyed. Solomon, with all the wealth that Solomon accumulated, he built the temple, and it was beautiful. It was like a gleaming, white, brilliant, massive structure on the top of a hill. You can see it from wherever you are, just about. And yet now it's just been laid to ruin. All that wealth and wonder. Which, by the way, the temple also kind of serves as almost a bank of sorts. If you had something valuable, you keep it in the temple. And so all these families lose all the things that their family has ever accumulated in one fell sweep. It's all stolen, melted down, taken back to Babylon. Their identity, everything's destroyed. And that's traumatic. And so 585 is a really traumatic event. Then you have a couple of years pass by. Sometimes I think we know the Babylonian captivity lasts 70 years, but it's not all of Israel was not, or all of Judah was not there for 75 or 70 years. They get to go back a little bit early, at least some of them do. And so you have in 536, Zerubbabel returns. And Zerubbabel's mission, of course, is what we're talking about, is to rebuild the temple. And he's going to go about that. Then in 516 BC, you have the completion of the second temple. And so it takes about 20 years to rebuild the temple. And I think this is really interesting. What's the reaction when they see the temple rebuilt?
Rejoiced and cried.
Yeah. The young people rejoice because we have the temple back. The old people weep because they remember what the temple was like back in Solomon's day, or Solomon's temple was like. And this new temple is nothing. It's in shambles. And so you have a contemporary minor prophet, Haggai, who writes about this. And he says, listen, you guys are weeping over the temple. I know it looks like nothing. It's nothing compared to what it was. But the glory of this temple is going to be greater than the glory of the previous temple. And of course, that doesn't quite make sense if we're just thinking about physical appearances. But what Haggai is thinking about is the presence of Christ, of course. And so the second temple is completed to some mixed reactions. Then you have Ezra returns about 50 years later or so. He returns to Jerusalem to kind of reinstall the religion of the people. Then you have a period where there's some turnover. Babylon's not quite Babylon that it was. You have now Artaxerxes who reigns. And of course, Artaxerxes, you may remember from the book of Esther, he begins to rule in 465, and then about 445, Nehemiah returns, and Nehemiah is going to go and try and rebuild the walls. He's going to do that. And then in 530 BC, around there, that's when Malachi is going to write his book, and the Old Testament is complete. And so just to kind of get a rough picture, I know the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is kind of there smack in the middle of your Old Testament, but it's really one of the last books. He's a contemporary with Malachi. And these are things that are all happening right around the same time at the end of the 400s BC. And then, as we talked about last summer, you have those 400 or so years where there's no direct revelation until John the Baptist comes back up in the New Testament. Any thoughts about any of that? I know that's kind of a lot, and dates are not always fun or easy to remember. But any thoughts about that? Does that help kind of place all of this in your mind? Okay. Well, if you want to, you can take a picture of it if you want or whatever, and you can have it for future posterity's sake, I guess. But we're running out of time. So some major themes. Leadership is very important. Mission and vision. We're going to talk about this a lot throughout this series. And also opposition. How should leaders function, especially when leaders are being challenged in their leadership? And so there's never going to be smooth sailing. It's always going to be rough waters. Sometimes it's a little rougher than other times. And so I think there's some good lessons to get from the leadership of these guys. And finally, restorationism. Because that's really what this has all been about. The ideal, the goal of these people is good. It is a good idea to rebuild the temple. It's a good idea to restore the religion. It's a good idea to rebuild the walls. But as we're going to see at the end of Nehemiah, it's going to be flawed. And it's not going to be exactly what it should be. And Nehemiah ends really on a downer. Nehemiah is looking and he surveys all that he sees, and he sees that people are not doing what they should do. He sees that the people are, the priests are not doing what the priests should do. The people are using those walls that they just built as markets, and they're not doing what they should do. The reforms of Ezra, people are working on the Sabbath. They shouldn't be doing that. And so it kind of ends on a downer. And the last line of Nehemiah is something along the lines of, Lord, remember me for the good that I've done. I've tried, and it's not gone exactly how I wish it would. Remember me for the good that I have done. And so I think this is kind of an interesting, these men have really good work, and they do very important things. But they can't make the people behave the way they always ought. And I think that's perhaps a situation we often find ourselves in. Restorationism is great. It's a great ideal, but people are not always going to do what they should. Malachi talks about that in 3:8. He says, you people are I can't remember what it is exactly off the top of my head, but he talks about the vainness of their actions. They're trying to cheat God, is what Malachi says. So, anyway, that's kind of a brief crash course into what Ezra and Nehemiah are going to be all about. Next week, we're going to get into it, and I think this will be a fun class, and I hope you guys think so too. See you guys next week.